Hello. The political and media narrative that oil will return to $60 per barrel by end of year and that oil supply will be fixed soon is wrong. The Strait of Hormuz blockade by Iran is the worst oil supply shock in history. Every day gets worse by the tune of 14.5 million barrels of lost supply of crude oil and refined products, among other critical goods and commodities. Even if the strait fully reopened today, we are multiple months, if not more than a year, away from fully restoring that full volume, and I'm here to explain why. My name is Christine Guerrero, and I'm an independent oil and gas strategic advisor. Today is April 27th, 2006, and I'm here to explain why the Iranian Hormuz blockade is the worst oil supply shock in history. The information that follows does not constitute investment advice. I'm not a financial advisor or a portfolio manager. I hold a petroleum engineering degree from the University of Tulsa and an MBA from Penn State University. I have professional certificates in decision science and energy policy from Stanford University and MIT. I spent 2 decades working on projects in more than 18 countries for the oil and gas industry prior to becoming a full-time investor and independent advisor in 2015. All observations presented are from my own opinions, my own research, and industry knowledge. There are no warranties or guarantees in life, but history often rhymes. We are now 59 days into the Strait of Hormuz being blocked. The battle over barrels is here. I've built this presentation with the goal of helping generalists and money managers understand why they are valid concerns of oil hitting all-time highs in the near term. In the post-World War II era, there have been 7 major oil supply shocks, and we are in the 8th and worst one right now. I'm not going to go into detail regarding the first one, the 1956 to 1957 Suez Crisis, which was a classic supply shock via choke point like the Iranian Hormuz blockade. Because in the 50s, oil prices were largely posted prices, set by major oil companies, so they were less volatile than today's spot market, and supply fully recovered in only 4 months. For this display, I'm using inflation-adjusted WTI oil price, as it is the price that U.S. politicians are most concerned with. I'm sorry to everyone who prefers to see Brent, even though we know it all tracks WTI. When you realize that the Arab oil embargo, the Iranian Revolution, and the Iran-Iraq war can be considered a cumulative supply shock, you quickly see that oil has always traded over $100 per barrel before supply and demand get repaired. The longer the supply squeeze, the higher the price of oil, with 2 shocks already achieving over 200% price inflation. Prior to the financial crisis in 2009, WTI hit over $200 per barrel in real terms, not due to war or embargoes, but due to a multi-year demand-driven supply squeeze, the super cycle. After the crash, the market normalized, and from 2010 to 2014, oil range traded between $110 and $150 in real terms until prices crashed again in late 2014. That's when oil production growth from the U.S. shale boom had become so great that it had upset OPEC national market dynamics, and Saudi Arabia responded by growing their production to regain market share. That's what drove crude oil prices down into the 40s in 2016, a true bare-knuckle global price war. Eventually, back then there was enough price damage and underinvestment occurred for common ground to be found, and oil was stabilizing in the $60 to $90 per barrel range prior to COVID. But even while oil prices remained low, U.S. shale producers continued to increase supply from 4.5 million barrels of oil per day to more than 9 million barrels of oil per day now. That's what kept oil prices low into the start of this year. But the operational data and leading indicators show that U.S. shale is now peaking. Now for more specific details. The second post-World War II supply shock is the 1973 to 1974 Arab oil embargo. It was the most impactful post-war oil supply shock until later events. It combined a targeted embargo with broad production cuts by Arab OPEC members in retaliation for Western support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. There was a 4 to 5 million barrel per day shortfall and prices tripled. This was a geopolitical supply shock rather than a pure production disaster. It exposed Western vulnerability. It led to the creation of the IEA and strategic reserves. It shifted power to producers and ushered in an era of higher energy prices and efficiency gains. Compared to the milder 1956 Suez Crisis, its price impact was far greater due to tight markets and coordinated OPEC action. The embargo's effects lingered into the late 1970s, compounded with the 1979 Iranian Revolution shock. The third post-World War II supply shock is that shock. It's also called the second oil shock or Iranian oil crisis. It compounded the major disruption from the Arab oil embargo and global oil markets, primarily through a collapse in Iranian production rather than by a formal embargo. Strikes and political upheaval began in late 1978 and halted much of Iran's output, leading to widespread panic despite the relatively modest net global shortfall. This was a classic supply shock plus panic episode. The physical disruption was smaller than in 1973, but produced a comparable economic jolt due to heightened fears and low spare capacity. It reinforced Western vulnerability to Middle East instability. It accelerated the shift toward non-OPEC supply like the North Sea and Alaska, and it helped spur long-term efficiency gains and energy diversification. Combined with the subsequent 1980 Iran-Iraq War, it kept prices elevated into the early 1980s before the 1986 oil glut. The fourth post-World War II supply shock is the 1980 Iran-Iraq War, also known as the First Gulf War, and it compounded the disruptions from the Iranian Revolution. Iraq invaded Iran in September 1980, leading to immediate attacks on oil infrastructure and a prolonged conflict that included the tanker war phase targeting oil exports. This shock is often viewed as an extension of the 1979 Iranian Revolution rather than a standalone event. It contributed to stagflation and recessions in the early 1980s. This is why it had a milder price impact than in 1973 or in 1979. Long term, it accelerated non-OPEC production growth, weakened OPEC discipline, and set the stage for the 1986 price collapse. The fifth post-World War II supply shock is the 1990 to 1991 Gulf War, also known as the First Persian Gulf War. It began with Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990. It caused a sharp but relatively short-lived oil supply disruption driven by the removal of production from both countries and fears of spillover into Saudi Arabia. This was a geopolitical supply shock with strong uncertainty premium. The physical disruption was comparable in scale to some prior events, but it had a milder, shorter price impact due to better preparedness through IEA coordination, SPR releases, and available spare capacity outside the region. This diversified non-OPEC supply and resulted in a swift military resolution. It contributed to the 1990s recession, but did not cause a prolonged stagflation as in the 1970s. I consider the sixth post-World War II supply shock to be the 2003 to 2008 oil supercycle, often centered on the dramatic 2007 to 2008 phase. It marked a sustained demand-driven run-up in oil prices rather than a classic geopolitical supply shock like the 1970s events. During these years, global demand, especially from emerging economies, boomed, while world oil production stagnated after 2005. This created a fundamental imbalance that required sharply higher prices to ration demand. This was a demand-driven supercycle price shock in a tight market. Contrasting with earlier supply disruption episodes, it had similar economic consequences to prior shocks. It contributed materially to the 2008-2009 U.S. recession by slashing consumer spending. The episode heightened peak oil fears. It accelerated investment in non-conventional sources, setting the stage for the later U.S. shale boom, and underscored oil's role in global macro stability. It was part of the broader 2000s commodity boom, but ended with a financial crisis demand collapse. The seventh post-World War II supply shock was a sanctions-driven trade disruption rather than a classic production collapse. The 2022 Russia-Ukraine war triggered a major yet atypical oil supply shock, driven primarily by Western sanctions, self-sanctioning by companies, and an EU embargo on Russian oil rather than direct destruction of production infrastructure. Russia was the third largest oil producer and a top exporter at the time. It still is, making the event geopolitically significant, but with a more contained net global impact than initial fears suggested. Compared to earlier shocks, better preparedness and flexible supply chains limited the economic damage, but it contributed to 2022's high inflation. The physical global supply hit was small, thanks to market adaptability, but it caused significant short-term volatility and an energy crisis in European gas. I believe Russia-Ukraine disruptions were a nothing burger in terms of global oil supply, but it's likely feeding into the market apathy that we are seeing today with oil. Most people believe that the current supply crisis will be resolved as quickly as it was in 2022. The current Hormuz blockade is different. This map identifies the locations of major oil fields in the Middle Eastern region. Most of the oil fields are located in and around the Persian Gulf. The reason why the Strait of Hormuz is so critical is that it's the gateway for 20 million barrels per day of crude oil and oil products, not to mention LNG, fertilizers, sulfur, methanol, graphite, aluminum, helium, glycol, iron ore, and other things. 19% of global crude supply and nearly 44% of global crude exports were transitioning the Strait of Hormuz prior to the Iranian blockade. Of the nearly 106 million barrels of crude oil being consumed each day prior to the blockade, 60% were moved by sea tankers, and 1/3 of that crude came through the Strait of Hormuz. Notice how 10% of the sea tankers were moving through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, where the Houthis of Yemen are now threatening to create another blockade in the region in coordination with Iran. The Hormuz blockade started on February 28th. And by the end of March, Saudi Arabia had rerouted some supply via its east-west pipeline, boosting Red Sea oil exports by 2.4 million barrels per day to 4.4 million barrels per day. The east-west pipeline is now operating at its full capacity, according to the Saudi Minister of Energy. And despite repeated strikes on their port, crude exports from UAE's Fujairah rose 450,000 barrels per day month over month and is now averaging 1.5 million barrels per day. There remains a disruption of nearly 14.5 million barrels per day right now, according to Goldman Sachs. That might climb further if war damage and blockade tightness escalates further. Oil exports from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and likely now Iran following Trump's blockade of the blockade have all crashed. Because of that, the current Strait of Hormuz blockade might be called the Second Persian Gulf War. The disruption to global supply totaled 9.1 million barrels per day in March, widened to 13.7 million barrels per day in April, and as I've said repeatedly, now stands at 14.5 million barrels per day, according to Goldman Sachs. It's the largest supply shock in history, and we don't even know when or how it will end. At least 31% of global oil exports are offline, and there is no spare capacity outside of the region. According to the U.S. Pentagon, mine clearing could take 6 months following a peace agreement. Also consider that it will take 2 to 3 months to reroute tankers and clear storage before oil production can fully restart. Not to mention, the extent of damage to regional oil facilities isn't well understood, but at minimum would require 3+ months to repair and reactivate. Crude oil prices have surged about 60% so far, but I believe they have further to run. Here is a side-by-side summary of all the post-World War II oil supply shocks. The ongoing Strait of Hormuz Blockade is the largest supply disruption in history in terms of scale, and it's not even close by comparison. The IEA is currently warning that it is greater than the Arab oil embargo, the Iranian revolution, and the Russia-Ukraine invasion combined. This could be the most important chart you'll see all year. For most of last year, analysts held the view that the oil market would be oversupplied until 2027. Due to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, things have dramatically and rapidly changed. We now have cumulative oil inventory losses of nearly 700 to 800 million barrels and on track to hit 1 billion barrels soon. Due to the lag effects, oil inventories are heading towards all-time lows even if the Strait of Hormuz reopens today. Notice how days of inventory, shown in blue, were approximately 25 days or lower during the supercycle in years 2005 through 2008. There is an inverse correlation between commercial crude inventories and oil prices. And as you would expect, the lower the crude inventories, the higher the oil prices. The battle over barrels is here, and we will continue to get worse until inventories begin to build again or high prices result in demand destruction. Here's a similar chart I created versus WTI inverted oil prices. The blue line is nominal price and the red line is the real inflation adjusted oil price. The inventory data shadowed in gray I pulled from the EISDO and then converted to days of consumption cover. Since the financial crisis, any time U.S. commercial oil inventories have fallen below 25 days, oil was sold at more than $100 per barrel in WTI real terms. The last time oil inventories were at these levels were early in the U.S. shale boom when tight oil production was less than half of today's volumes. When inventories sustain levels below 25 days, oil prices previously climbed to approximately $150 per barrel in real terms. Based on my current forecast, the U.S. will hit these levels in a few months, potentially in June, but maybe sooner, considering that last week the Wall Street Journal reported that more than 60 empty crude supertankers were streaming toward the American Gulf Coast to fill up, roughly triple pre-war levels, and a sign that U.S. exports will only rise further in the months ahead. The historical peak for crude was in July 2008, prior to the financial crisis, at approximately $150 per barrel nominal. In real terms, that would be about $230 per barrel today. And no oil analyst who has done similar work would be surprised if we exceeded that level, given what we already know about this supply crisis. Inelastic oil demand is easy to demonstrate. There was very little decline in oil demand in 2008 when prices were at all-time highs, and again during COVID when much of the world was locked down. U.S. oil producers can't fill the supply gap this time. They can barely even respond. According to the EIA, U.S. oil production will decline this year in spite of higher oil prices. That's because this year's production was based on last year's oil prices. Supply chains and well operations simply can't scale in time to offset lost Middle Eastern supply. Capital discipline is an E&P talking point. What's actually happening is they are running low on drilling inventory. They are running out of wastewater storage solutions. They have limited natural gas takeaway, and they often have to shut in wells due to negative natural gas prices during shoulder seasons. They also have a very tight service market for high-specs rigs and pumping units required for today's complex wells. This is very different than how U.S. shale responded and grew post-COVID, because during COVID we had a buildup of a giant inventory of drilled yet uncompleted wells called DUCs. In the years since, we have steadily completed and activated those DUC wells, which mask the true price and complexity of adding U.S. supply. DUC inventories are now at maintenance levels, which means that we have to increase drilling before we can increase completions. And there is nearly a 12-month lag in that activity, in addition to the bottlenecks I just mentioned. These are the hard truths that affect forward oil prices. There is no spare capacity for additional oil production outside of the Middle Eastern Gulf Coast countries and Iran today. The IEA reported more than 80 energy facilities have been damaged so far across the broader Middle East, and approximately 34 have suffered serious damage that will take months to years to repair due to specialized equipment backlogs and labor shortages. When the strait reopens, the Gulf Coast countries are unlikely to return to pre-war levels this year, in my opinion. As seen from historical shocks, oil demand is relatively inelastic, so prices will grow much more painful before meaningfully changing consumption behavior. If the US or Israel damage Iran's power grid, Iran's oil production will likely be crippled as well, resulting in a prolonged outage and loss of long-term global exports. If Iran retaliates further by damaging more regional infrastructure, it will be even more difficult and longer before they can return to pre-war levels. This situation is far from over. Investors need to know that when global oil inventories decline, the oil futures strip price will also climb, and so will their fair market target prices for oil and gas equities. We've already seen from February 27th to March 31st, there was approximately $12 per barrel increase in strip prices 6 to 12 months out. So don't focus on the day-to-day movements of oil. Focus on the directional movement of the strip prices in 6 to 12 months. That's what I do. Even the EIA believes that if the Hormuz blockade was resolved today, Brent crude oil isn't going to fall below $80 per barrel until next year. Compare that to the forecast of $50 per barrel made just 2 months ago in February, before the blockade was enacted. Also remember that oil price appreciation by at least 50% either preceded or coincided with most U.S. recessions since the 70s. This price shock will present significant headwinds to growth, the global economy, and risk assets. In conclusion, I hope you found this information helpful and will share it with anyone who you believe might benefit from it. Given my background, I consider myself uniquely positioned to provide this information, and I'm trying to do my part in helping generalists understand what's happening with oil right now. If you would like to reach out to me about speaking engagements or private consultations regarding the macro or specific oil and gas companies, I'm available on LinkedIn. I use the handle SheDrills on X, or you can use the email address on the title side of this presentation to contact me. Thank you.